When Russia mounted the Ukrainian invasion on the 24th of February 2022, it was supposed to be a piece of cake. Get a couple of tanks, march into Ukraine, and have Kiev on its knees in less than a week. However, as it's turned out, things weren't that simple. The conflict has dragged on for almost an eternity, leaving many desperate for the day when the horrors would finally end. But today, the horrors are over. It's finally official. After 3 years of senseless, bitter warfare, billions of dollars in aid, and countless lives lost, both armies are finally ready to lay down their arms. And no, this didn't stem from some United Nations resolution, NATO intervention, or European Union diplomacy. No, this time, all this progress actually came from a simple phone call, one that had two of the world's most powerful men on both ends of the line. For 2 long hours, President Donald Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin settled down for a call, and eventually decided to start negotiations for a ceasefire. Love him or hate him, Trump seems to have succeeded in minutes where international organisations had tried for years and failed. And although some might still view this latest development with scepticism, here's how a 2-hour phone call between President Donald Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin is quickly returning hope to the most despondent of spirits. It's been 3 years since Russia's special operation began, and since then, it's pretty clear that it hasn't achieved any positive outcomes for the Kremlin or everyone else involved. Both sides have lost big and gained almost nothing in return. Kiev continues to be suffocated by the Russians, who, on their own hand, are losing unimaginable amounts of money and human resources every day that the fighting continues. The figures are staggering, almost downright unbelievable. Almost 13,000 Ukrainians have lost their lives since the war began. Over in Russia, there have been 652 casualties, but it's the military's losses that are the most horrific. The latest estimates show Russia has lost 790,000 soldiers, while Ukraine's casualty tally has reached 400,000. Nearly 30,000 military tanks, naval vessels, and aircraft have been destroyed. A joint number of 83,000 military personnel have been declared missing, and frankly, even if they were deserters, one has to sympathise with them. Since the invasion began on February 24th, 2022, Russia has only gained 27,498 square miles of its enemy. That's about half of New York State and only 12% of Ukraine's territory. A 3-year-long offensive definitely should have yielded better results, so it's hard to blame anyone who got frustrated and decided to abscond. Nearly 15,000 civilians have lost their lives to the war, and more than 30,000 innocent people have been declared injured. But here's the part no one seems to be talking about loudly enough. A good number of those deaths weren't just caused by bullets and bombs. The war has been destroying lives in other ways too. As things stand, the indirect toll might be even worse. The disease, the famine, the mental breakdowns. Before the war began, 100% of the Ukrainian population had access to electricity and 89% had access to clean water. Now, it's not the same anymore. Ukraine is living in darkness. Babies are being born without doctors. Malnutrition, as well as disease, are spreading like wildfire. The people's mental health? It's being forced to collapse under the weight of the constant trauma. Can everyone bear such daily horrors? Of course not. Since the start of the war, there has been a large-scale exodus of citizens from both sides of the war. Cutthroat politics and a collapsing economy have forced 800,000 Russians to leave their homeland since 2022, when the war began. That's 0.6% of the country's population gone. In Ukraine, the numbers are much steeper. 10.6 million Ukrainians have been displaced. Now, for a better idea of the situation, Ukraine's population before the war was 44 million strong, so the fighting has now forced 23% of the population to move elsewhere. That's 1 in every 4 Ukrainians forced to leave their homes. For those who haven't been lucky enough to have the means to escape, 3.7 million Ukrainians are now internally displaced, with the other 6.9 million refugees having to cross borders all over Europe. Without any doubt, the damage has been catastrophic, and that's exactly why the rest of the world was so pleased when on Monday, March 19th, Trump finally announced that the war would be soon coming to an end. In a lengthy post made through his Truth Social account, he made known that he'd just gotten off of a 2-hour phone call with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, and that they'd discussed working towards means of reaching a peaceful agreement between Putin and Ukraine. He stated, Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations towards a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. He, however, mentioned that there would be very minimal US meddling in the peace talks, as it was his intention for both countries to reach a mutual agreement on their own, without any third-party incursion. It would be much better this way, as they were aware of intricate negotiation details that the rest of the international community aren't aware of. And maybe he's right. While many of us might think we know everything about the war and that an external mediator is absolutely necessary, that isn't the case. We're outsiders. A lot of what we know right now has come from news headlines which, if we're being honest, could be biased to some extent. We don't know the full details. Still, Trump's post mentioned that the Vatican had shown interest in hosting the peace talks. He also added that he had immediately informed President Zelensky of Ukraine and other top European leaders from France, Italy, and the European Commission about the development following his phone call. However, despite all of the excitement Trump's post has created, not everyone's buying it. Putin, in a statement given to reporters after the phone call, did agree that the call was meaningful and that he was open to peace talks, but has still refused to backtrack on certain things. One of them is the US proposed 30-day unconditional ceasefire, which Ukraine had already agreed to. Putin is still saying no to that, even though, according to Washington, that was the main reason for the phone call. In previous episodes, Russia has said no to these extended ceasefires, arguing that they'd just give Ukraine more time to regroup at a time when Russian forces are making battlefield advances. Russia's nonchalance towards the ceasefires seems to be giving warning echoes of past peace talks that did break down in 2022. And now, many analysts, including the former Russian diplomat Boris Bondarev, who resigned in protest against the 2022 invasion, are suggesting that Putin could be playing Trump and doesn't mean to stop the war at all. They fear he's only playing a waiting game with Washington, so that in another year or so, Russia would be at a much more advantageous position at the negotiation table. By then, Kiev would be forced to bend to Putin's will. But although it is true that Putin's exclusion of the US or any third party from the peace talks could be a bad sign, there's a glimmer of hope. Trump hasn't mentioned anything about imposing any new sanctions against Russia if they refuse to cooperate. In fact, he's sort of taken a back seat, agreeing that if they aren't able to decide on something concrete, he might be forced to back away. Apparently, Trump's realised that his previous tariff for fire tactics aren't working anymore, and that a more cautious approach is needed to achieve any sort of success. And success, in this context, could mean a world of positives. The war has done an awful lot of damage to the economies of both countries, and even the rest of the world. Both countries were major suppliers of natural gas and oil to the rest of Europe. But since the war stopped their exports, energy prices have surged, resulting in economic slowdowns. Jointly, Russia and Ukraine have supplied 30% of global wheat exports, but of course, the war also affected that. Ukraine's wheat exports fell sharply, but rose in Europe, where oversupply created tensions. With the war out of the way, we could be headed to a time of economic stability once again. Trump has already mentioned that the amount of money and jobs that could be made out of the ceasefire are unlimited. Ukraine would have the chance to generate billions and then fund the rebuilding of its rubble. Russia too can now begin to do business with the rest of the world, America included. Their fears? Could the possibility of profit be blinding Trump to the real state of things? Although this new change of heart is quite different from the Trump we all know, considering the fact that he's a capitalist at heart, they might be right. And if that's the case, it could push him to give in too easily to Putin's maximalist demands, further undermining Ukraine's sovereignty, which was the whole point of them not surrendering much earlier. Still, as it all stands, all we can do now is hope that the phone call actually ends the war, because if this actually goes on, we could be headed for even darker times, with even more deaths and economic losses for the rest of the outside world. But what do you think of it all? Is Russia just playing Trump for a fool? Or is he really ready to negotiate? Let us know in the comments, and before you go, check out this video on how Trump's words flipped the stock market on its head. Oh, and remember to subscribe too.